Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to another episode of Desert Island Books. And I have Fred, and not a booktuber, not a YouTuber, but we go back quite a while, at least a decade on Twitter. So I'm glad we can have you here today, Fred, and tell us something about yourself.
So I'm Fred, or AWL, sometimes write as Alice Earl, that's ALYS. And I am a writer, I am a storyteller, and I do a bit of folklore stuff as well. And I've always been a really avid reader, particularly of gothic, fantasy, and science fiction books.
Cool. And sorry?
Sorry, yeah.
No, and you've chosen 8 books for us today.
Yes.
And so yeah, we can just jump into that, I guess, unless there's anything else you wanted to say, and then we can go through each book.
Yeah, no, that's grand.
Yeah. Oh, I just want to say to everybody, there is a lag in back and forth here. So if there's pauses in between, it's not awkward pauses, it's pauses for the internet for everything catching up. Like that.
Like that, just like that. So yeah, do I just start talking about the books, or?
Yeah. Just do you have any of them there to show? You don't need them all.
I do know. I have most of them.
Okay.
So the first one I'm going to start with is Little Big by John Crowley or Crawley. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. I know how to do Alistair, but I don't know if this guy's pronounced the same. This book is a epic fantasy novel set in New York State, I believe, about the fairy court, and it's one of the foundational texts of urban fantasy. And it is my desert island book. It's why it's coming up first. It is an absolute tome. It's very, very dense. It is beautifully written. And so as a child, I was really obsessed with fairies. I mean, I still am a bit. Currently trying to sell a novel about them, which is inspired, not in a small part, by Little Big. But this book came to me in a really sort of crucial time of my life when I was beginning to mature from being, I've always wanted to write books, but from being a child who wrote in a very sort of straightforward, childish way about sort of fantasy characters I'd invented that were based on me. I was actually moving on to thinking more in a sort of adolescent-y way about the craft of writing and what it meant to be a writer in a more serious way. I was getting very into poetry at that point. And it was given to me by someone who is one of the biggest influences on my life and on my work, a man called Bill Lewis. Now, he is a painter and poet and writer. He's also, just coincidentally, my godfather. And throughout my life, he has given me books that have completely changed my life. And this, although it did not have the impact, perhaps, of a few of the others he's given me, it has had the longest lasting effect. I mean, you can see from the state of it, this book's been pretty well read to death. And I think the reason it stays with me is that there's always more to it. It is quite a psychological text. It's quite a philosophical text. There's a lot of play with time, with back and forth, with a lot of novels about fairies are very interested either in just retelling a folktale, a thing I love, or engaging with them in the manner of an RPG. And I've got nothing against books like that, but I find it quite stifling, both intellectually and I guess emotionally as a reader. I feel that these are sort of folkloric beings, that there is a huge weight of myth that cannot be categorized simply through sort of check box. These are the strengths and weaknesses, and this is how you defeat, and this is how you interact with, and this is, it's not gameable, it's not playable. And this book, because it predates all of that, it's when was it originally published? 81, so it's early 80s, sort of predates a lot of that, and instead really engages with the sort of late Victorian spiritualist approach to the fairy world, and that time when we were beginning to categorize myth, and brings that through into fiction, but in such a sort of specifically American way. It's set in New York State, in New York City, and about how innovation and modernism and eventually sort of a post-apocalyptic world, it runs through many, many years, can be understood through the terms of this mythic architecture. It's deeply wonderful, and it feeds into so many of my interests. I mean, as a folklorist, I spent most of my sort of academic career refuting the findings of the people that Crowley is basing this book on. But it hit me at that point in my life where I was going from sort of, not Flat Fairies and Enid Blyton, I was a bit older than that, but from fairly sort of, from Diana Wynne Jones and sort of Tamara Pierce, I guess, into more adult fiction. And my intellectual interests and my sort of folkloric interests, which have always been there, were taking that little turn on their head to the more academic, to the more craft-based, to the more intellectual. And this, I think, put the spin on it. And it's why I think a lot of people who are interested in that sort of fantasy thing as young people either stay with it in the same form or they grow out of it. And I didn't. I went and wrote 2 dissertations on it, and I'm hoping to go back and do a PhD at some point, plus like a whole 4-book novel series. So, I think this one had quite an impact, if in quite a quiet way. But it's also a book I could read endlessly. Yeah,
I'd heard of it when I saw your list. I had heard of it before, but I knew nothing about it. And I was looking it up last night, and I go, this sounds fascinating. And I just sort of, I was spending too much time on that. And I go, I might as well just get the book some point and read it. Yeah. Because I've never been, as people that know and watch my videos, I've never been a huge fantasy fan, but I do like the folklore in behind it, and that's what grabbed me with this, and bringing, as you say, like a spin on it, like that, and not your stereotypical fantasy type or fairy type story. At least that's the appearance I got from it. So I'm glad you clarified that. So that really makes me want to read it more. But I don't have much more to say myself about that because I haven't read it. So, but it sounds.
What's
good.
so remarkable about it is that it doesn't, like a lot of books, are like, well, this isn't your typical fairy story. Spend so much of their effort on that, and he's like, no, he just doesn't even bother with that question. It's so fresh. It doesn't try and sort of defy or engage with it, just takes it as a simple fact. Within the context of this book, fairies are real and they have an influence on the human life world. And we run with that. And it was so refreshing, even as a relative child, to read that. It isn't a fantasy novel. I mean, it is a fantasy classic, so obviously it is a fantasy novel, but it doesn't conceive of itself as a fantasy novel. It has none of the bounds that readers and writers and critics often put upon fantasy.
Yeah, well, like I've sorry, yeah, like I said, fantasy. The word fantasy has too much baggage with it. A lot of times, as a definition of a genre, that every time you use the word, everybody sees something different, or pretty well something different. Like science fiction is the same thing to a certain extent, but I think fantasy has more of that than the word science fiction, and that's a bit of an issue because it's so big. So to categorize this, as you say, as pure just fantasy is missing something by the looks of it. It's really missing something there.
Yeah, and I do sometimes think that is a bit of a sort of a snobbery on the part of readers, but I think this book, although it is written in a fantasy tradition, you can read it with no knowledge of a fantasy tradition and still find so much to love in it. And reading it from a fantasy tradition, I don't feel adds an awful lot to it. It doesn't. Like, I love a lot of fantasy classics. If you read something like Robert Holdstock, who's another favourite of mine, he is often said, well, it's not really fantasy, it goes beyond that, etc., and above that. But if you read it in a fantasy tradition, it is a fantasy novel. You can tell that. Whereas with this, almost you can't. if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I'm really wanting to read this now. So that's the bad thing of doing these episodes, because there's always something that I never really, I may have heard of but never looked into it, and I go, damn, this is bad. I got my reading set out for too many years ahead.
Yeah, and this one will take you a while. It is quite hefty. There's recently been an anniversary edition. I think 40th anniversary. It's 81. But
Don't remind me how long ago that is. Oh,
I know, right? But it is out of my budget. Let's put it like that. I hope they're going to bring out a paperback at some point, because my copy is falling apart and I need a new one.
So what's that's a fascinating one. And so what's the next one?
Let's go to the next one. So let's go on to Collected Ghost Stories. I'll try to get this on screen. Of M.R. James. Probably the next obvious choice for me. So anybody who has encountered me trying to promote my novel Time's Fool will know that I have always loved ghost stories. And that M.R. James is like the foundational part of my love of ghost stories. And so if anyone's watching this, forgive me if you've heard this story before. But my family have a lot of ghost stories in them, and my dad used to tell them to me when I was a child. He's a very talented storyteller himself. He's very dynamic, very affecting, and he's got a great memory for these things. And one day we were out on a walk I grew up in Kent, in a village. We were up above the village looking down over the valley. It was a really cold December's day. I said, "Will you tell me a ghost story?" And my dad, picking his brain, he's an amateur archaeologist as well, so we've been field walking, presumably came up completely dry and was like, I don't know what to do. And so told me a sort of edited oral history version of "Oh, Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad." And this story completely haunted me. I mean, hearing it after you've been field walking, you've been looking for sort of the nebulous treasure of the soil, and with the mist on the valley and the winter night drawing in, it was chilling. And the difference between an oral and a literary ghost story is that just that degree of chill, I feel, often. And he, when I was a little bit older, pointed me in the direction of an old book of his, which was called Tales of Mystery and Imagination. Now, this is not to be mistaken for the Edgar Allan Poe Tales of Mystery and Imagination. This was an old ITV TV series that filmed versions of classic horror stories.
Yeah.
And in it had two M.R. James tales. It had Lost Hearts and Room 13. It also had Carmilla, I think The Fall of the House of Usher, and a handful of others. So that was my first vampire story. And I stole this from my father after he had lent it to me. He didn't get that back for years. And then one day I found this Collected Ghost Stories of M.R. James on my bed when I came home. I don't know where he picked it up. I think he must have got it at a kind of junk stall at a market or something. And it's just wonderful. It's one of the books I return to most often. And it's a real sort of special shared thing, I think, between my dad and I, that we love this. I love the precision of James's prose. I love the way it's rooted deeply, deeply into history and into geography of the United Kingdom. A lot of them are set in East Anglia, where I lived for 14 years, which, God, that was eerie. I mean, you've been reading these since you were a child, and you're at university and you see them flying the Three Crowns flag and you think, "Warning to the curious." Or you're kind of walking home and they've got a level land stretching away, and you don't want to see sort of scarecrows or white sheep figures or any other sort of James's wonderful monsters coming out at you. Obviously, I've been to Aldeborough, which is Seaford, from Warning to the Curious. Spent a lot of time hanging around at Dunwich. It's, if there is a book that located me in the type of Gothic I am, it's this one, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I share your love of them, and every 2 years I read through them. I use the newer Penguin 2-volume edition by I always get his initials wrong. S.T. Joshi, I think, edited them and with the notes. The Lovecraft sort of scholar-ish.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's yeah, they're just amazing. So what would, do you have a favorite story or one that you always think about, go back to? Is it I'll Whistle and I'll Come, or?
So A Whistle remains a favourite. I took my dad for his 60th birthday, which was a little while ago now. Don't tell him I said that. To Green Gnome Manor, where Robert Lloyd Perry did a reading of A Whistle and I Come to You, and it remains very, very precious to me. But I think, and let's see if I can get the title right, because I always get it wrong. The one that haunts me most is an episode of Cathedral History. I always get it mixed up with another story, but it's the events of it that get me. It's The Residence at Whitminster, which is almost vampiric. And it's the one of where you have the boy Saul in it, who gets involved in the dark arts, and murders his fellow. And it's the one with the a poor thin ghost. It's just really creepy. There's James very rarely strayed into that sort of sinister interpersonal nastiness. His evil is often distant from the past and a little bit intangible. But in The Residence at Whitminster, it becomes more human. And it has a more specific personality. And I find that probably his most chilling.
Yeah, I find it really difficult to find a favorite one. Or what is it? Albrecht's scrapbook I really like as well. But then there's other ones like Lost Hearts is so creepy. It's like you mentioned the word creepy, and it's like just the thought of it. And I even got a book. I have a collection of ghost stories that are children, and it's in there, and with a bunch of others, because it's almost like a tiny subgenre that is just, it's too weird and creepy to even think about in some ways, ghost children.
Yeah, no, it's really unsettling, and it's something we don't deal with a lot today, because partly because our infant mortality rate is a lot lower. But that corruption of innocence, and I think actually you say Lost Hearts, that's one of the other ones where the evil becomes human, really, and it's obviously another one with sort of dark magics in it.
Yeah. You mentioned vampire, and a friend of mine, I've just this year, because I was rereading them, and I got her to start reading M.R. James, and she really likes the Anne Rice list, the vampire Lestat in that. Yeah. And when she read Count Magnus, she has made a, because Anne Rice is, I think, she thinks it's referring to the story Count Magnus, because there is a Count Magnus that turns Lestat into a vampire. Is that correct? And that's the Count Magnus?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Is it Magnus? I'm reading bloody Queen of the Damned right now. I really should know that, information, but yeah, I think it is. Yeah. I've wondered if there was some influence there as well, especially with the sort of the locks and the inviting, and yeah.
And that makes me more interested just in itself to read, because I have not read any of that Rice stuff. I've tried, but I haven't read any. And I think the first thing I'm going to read is not a vampire one; it's her mummy one. And I think that'll probably be the first one, because I even if I don't like anything, I'll be able to like enough because it's a mummy story. So therefore, and if I like it enough, then I can move on to something else.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I would say if you want to start with Rice, I'd start with Cry to Heaven, which isn't a horror book at all. It's about the castrati in Venice. It was the first one of hers I
don't know
read.
that one. I never even heard of that one, actually.
It's great. It's very sort of sensual novel about music and about revenge. It's a revenge tragedy in its way. I suppose it's not a tragedy. But it's about a boy from a sort of noble Venetian family who is has a sort of very pure soprano voice, and in order to dispossess him, his brother has him castrated and sells him to a music school. It's just very very unsettling, very very beautiful, very tender, and very very violent. All at once, and I think it really sort of captures that. Is Baroque the right word? Kind of Baroque music, that sort of feeling of it, this sort of overblown emotion.
Stop, because you're gonna, like, I'm adding too many books.
Sorry.
But yeah, well, that's the other thing with this. We usually get sidetracked a little bit occasionally, so that's going to happen, and I think everybody's expecting that now after 20 some episodes. So, but I try to not go too far, but I don't always succeed. But yeah, is there anything else about the MRJ, or to go on to the next one, or?
I mean, I could talk endlessly about MRJ. I think we'll go on to the next one, shall we? So what we're going to do next? All right, so I'm going to sandwich it in here. I'm going to do my non-fiction book. And this is Vanished Kingdoms by Norman Davies. I've only read this once, which is rare for me for a book I love. And one of the reasons I put it on my desert island list is I'd really like to read it again. But it's quite heavy going, and every time I try and read a non-fiction book, I then buy a fiction book and read that instead. So it's a fault of mine. But so this is a book about countries that aren't there anymore. It's straight up historical, kind of history of geography. I can't believe I'm saying this. I don't even really recognize myself reading this. It's something that is so far outside of my ballpark. Obviously, I love history, but what I love about it is that it requires one to step outside of the known shape of our world. It's quite a challenging book in that way, and it talks about all the sort of kingdoms that once existed and were part of the map and were part of the sort of standard order of the world as everyone knew it. And you would draw a map and they would be on there, and they had boundaries and they had kings and they had culture, and that just aren't there anymore. So it talks about the Old North and the Danelaw, and it talks about the Aragonese Empire, and it runs through European history. Its scope is limited too. And I just feel like it really unsettles. We have this really fraught nation sort of idea of nationhood and borders and boundaries, and this sense that the map doesn't change. But of course, the map is changing all the time, and something that was accepted as a standard part of the world that we then try to reconceptualize through our world, through sort of the terms we understand it, can actually just cease to be. And that cannot be reduced to, well, it was just Northern England. And it's like, no, it was a whole separate country with a separate culture and a separate set of laws and customs and identity. And I feel this ties in a bit to a book that was really shortlisted for me and did not make the final cut, which is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke, where you have Northern England as a separate country. Great favourite book, just finished rereading it. Highly recommend it. But this is the history of it, it's the geography of it, and the sense and the space of it, in a way that makes you look at modern political conflict, at the modern world, at your own sense of identity as a person navigating the world in this sort of somewhat unsettled light. It's fascinating. And it's something as I say, I normally struggle to read non-fiction books, and this just absorbed me. And I was reading it just after I finished doing my master's degree, which was technically in early medieval and early modern textual cultures, which sort of takes apart everything we think we know about the book and reading and writing. And this was like, and maps. So I was really in a very receptive place to read it. But yeah, it's just fascinating.
Yeah, it's one that I've wanted to read of his. I've read Europe, and what's the one, the British Isles? I can't remember now. But they're both hefty books as well. Like that's what he seems to go in. But I like the idea of this fluidity of borders. Like regardless, like people think that because several generations there is a border there, but it is fluid because over time, and people are a bit fluid too. And I think that's what he. Or am I wrong? That he talks about that. At least that's the impression I get of how things like you do have borders, but they're not really borders. There is no walls. It's like the culture is fluid. Everything's fluid, but for a period of time, people see it as structure and walls.
Yeah, and living as I do now near the Scottish border, you can see it, and you can see that where the border has settled makes sense geographically. Like you will get to the foot of a big hill, and there's the border, because over that, if there was an army trying to sort of force the edges of one country, it was going to meet a bit of an obstacle there, or a river, or we have borders form naturally when countries are at war, but the culture of the borders is one that sort of that remained separate. I mean, there was a separate border law, and that remains even now, and it lingers, even though where I live, it's very Scottish, and down in Carlisle, it is very, very English. But the old Brever families considered themselves border people before they considered themselves Scottish or English, because the border kept moving. And it's a similar interest. It's that sense of liminality around our lives. Is this a theme I'm coming back to? The liminal? Might be.
I can see that might come up in. I'm not sure what order you're doing it in, but no, not the next one. The one after. It depends. Well, anyway, that's.
I've picked a really. I had it all written down in a nice, neat list for you, and I'm just jumping all over the place, aren't I?
Yeah. Well, no, actually, you're going and oh yeah. The Norman Davies was down below, but I was thinking, which one are you going to do next? Let's and then if it is,
you tell me which one I'm going to do next.
Okay. Well, I was thinking of the Angela Carter, the short story collection, The Bloody Chamber. I think it's short story collection, isn't it?
It is a short story collection, yes.
So I thought that might, because you what you mentioned there might sort of work into that.
Yep, it's a very different kind of liminality in this one. I can. Is my camera working for you? It seems to have frozen at this end.
It's froze, but I can still we can still hear you. So hopefully.
So I'll just describe rather than waving it. So this is The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. This is another book that is in about the same nick as my copy of Little Big.
We lost. Hopefully, Fred can come back. This is always an issue when you're dealing with the internet, or potential issue. Well, maybe that is not going to happen. Okay.
Where
Yeah.
had I got to?
You're back now. Right. There was a bit of a dead space there while I was waiting for you to come back, but
No.
this happens. So, but if I stop it, then we have to start all over. So I didn't
Yeah,
want to do that.
that's all right. So where had I got to? And I know I was doing like a
Uh,
full lecture.
yeah. We'll start over with the Angela Carter volume.
Okay, so it's a collection of modernized, often feminist, but certainly sort of psychologically informed retellings of traditional fairy tales, usually of the animal bridegroom or the Bluebeard type. And I was given this by Bill Lewis. The Christmas I turned 14, uh, quite young.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
Quite young, and as one would do with a book like this, when you're unfamiliar with the writer, I flicked through, found the shortest story in it, and read that to see what I thought of it. The shortest story in this is The Snow Child, which is a retelling of Snow White, very loosely, and it is the most brutal, upsetting, sort of sexually graphic short story I've probably ever read in my life. And it just blew the back of my head off. Just complete. I didn't know you could do that in fiction. I didn't know you were allowed to do that in fiction. I didn't have any sense that this was what I was getting myself into. I was, very transitional stage of my life, going through puberty, beginning to sort of think about sex and bodies and aging. And I was at the fairy tale age, the age where all these sort of stories are often set. And it catalyzed me into, I don't know what kind of person I would be if I hadn't read this at 14. The rest of the stories are not anything like so intense, although they're not gentle. But it took me through. It took me through from being a child to being an adult. I reread it almost once a year. It used to be more often. It's probably slightly less now. They are incredibly sensual. They are incredibly insightful into the human condition, and they are fascinated by the danger inherent in sexuality and sensuality and closeness to another person. She was very influenced by Freud. I think she was very influenced by Lacan. There is an intelligence here that opened out the sort of darker underbelly of our cultural myths, both the ones that formed fairy tales and the ones that perpetuate now. I don't know if, again, it depends a bit on your views. I'm transgender, so I went through puberty as a girl. And in a body that felt very alien and unfamiliar to me, and I had a lot of mental health problems as a result of it, this was sort of my life raft through it all. It kept me connected to the part of my body and the part of my life. And it let me survive until I reached a sort of stable enough and adult enough place to go, hang on a minute, might not actually be a girl after all that. Let's do something about this. And I think it's a mythology that allows that. It is transformative in that way. And again, it's liminal. I mean, puberty is one of the key liminal spaces of our lives. So yeah, Angela Carter, one of the saints of my pantheon. And this book was my introduction to her. And it's the reason I probably still stay in the sort of folkloric model.
Yeah, well, the one thing that I sort of like, I haven't read a whole lot of her, but because you mentioned the sexual aspect of her stories, but the real sort of fairy tales or a lot of the stuff she's basing this on, the originals, like we've
Mm.
or a lot of people have the sanitized versions.
Mm.
You know, the real ones have this undertone of
Mm.
sexuality, and not everything, but a lot of them do.
Mm.
And she just took that and ran with it, you know, and didn't even try to hide it. You know,
No.
it's right up there in front.
Yeah, she brought it right up to the surface, and she wedded it. I mean, they're set throughout time, but she wedded it to our sort of current understandings of it as well. Not just what it said about, because I mean, you read sort of Marina Warner and people like that, and they talk about what sex and sexuality meant in the time that fairy tales were formed. Whereas Carter's like, yeah, that's important. But what's also important is, what do they mean now? What do they mean in the context of the contraceptive pill, of woman's lib, of sort of property ownership in the middle of the 20th century? That there is a relevance to Carter that I think a lot of retellings of fairy tales really miss.
Yeah, it's like I say, it's something I think I read. I think it was because of you talking about it. I think I actually started reading some. I don't know if I ever mentioned to you, but I started reading some because I remember going to the British Library, and they're having some manuscripts of hers there, and I got bollocked for I was trying to take photos and then sent them to you, and they wouldn't allow me to do that. So I just said, by the way, I'm here. I actually am looking at this, but I can't send you a picture.
I remember that.
Yeah, I almost got kicked out for trying to take pictures.
But yeah, she's a dangerous writer. That's why I love her.
No, yeah, and that's a fabulous story there. Well, all these are with you know the connections with these, and I just love that of how people, you know, what it means, what literature means to them, what books mean to them, and how they discovered it. And it's always fascinated me, and how it actually, people say, oh, it's just a story, it's just a book, but it depends on when you read it, and it can have so much long lasting influence on you, and sometimes you don't even know it.
No,
that's the other thing.
No, absolutely.
So what are we out? What's next then for that?
What's next? Okay, I'm going to go on to the one that is not a book that has a great story attached to it, but that instead probably marks one of my failures, and that is Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, which I've never read.
You've not read it?
I've never read it. I'm coming on here talking about a book I've never read. I have read the first volume of it, which I got out of the library, read it, enjoyed it, needed to take a break from it, because, you know, it's a fairly hefty tome. You need to take breaks sometimes with big books. Was loving it, was really drawn into these tragic characters and the world that he paints. I mean, it's a bit sentimental, but it was wonderful. Sent the first volume back to the library, thought, I'll get the second one in a couple of weeks. You don't want to just go straight on. And then my life went completely mental. And I've just never gone back to it. So it hangs over me, the book I've not finished, looming there. And I think if I have a desert island, I would really, really love to go back. Everyone I know who's read it says it's wonderful.
I that was one of my books. Like, I had somebody else do mine as well, and that was one of my books. But I bent the rules. I'm taking one story, but I took like 6 translations of it, and I'm gonna sit there on the desert island and with notebooks and meticulously chart the differences in the translation.
Yep.
Because
I think I'd need a good translation.
Yeah, I'd love to do that, but it's like the momentous work that would be to read like chapter by chapter, and then going back and forth and sort of looking at the subtle differences and stuff like that. But it would be fascinating because I love it so much.
Yes, and I want to love it. I want to finish it. I want to read it. I want the full experience of it. And I know one of these days I'm just going to sit down and do it. But until then, it's my one of my desert island books. I'm taking it with me.
Yeah, there's a newer-ish translation. I forget what her name is that Penguin has put out. That has about 100 pages more than the one that I've read several times. So I've yet to read that one. So I suspect it's going to be like reading a new book, because in some ways, and the thing is, I think it divides a lot of people. They either love the musical and they've never read the book, or a recent film, that the adaptation, or they love the book and then the others don't like it because of the digressions. He goes into these huge digressions of the history of Waterloo, the Battle of Waterloo, the history of the hare's shirt, the history of the convent, and all this stuff. And those things I just savored, and I just loved those.
Well, that was part of the reason I enjoyed it. I mean, I love a kind of rip-roaring story that kind of takes you, but he was in no hurry, and because it's a social history more than a romance, more than an adventure, more than anything. That stuff really matters. Like in some books, it doesn't matter. You can kind of skim over it all and just get to the sort of meat of the plot. But I felt like it wasn't just a padding. It was, until you understand what Waterloo did to France, you can't understand what happened at this tavern.
Yeah.
And that, I love it when someone takes that much care over a story. It's why I want to go back to it so badly.
Yeah, I meant to reread it this year, but I didn't, and I've kicked myself. So, I had this plan at the beginning of the year to read and reread other big books. Like I've not read War and Peace. I've not read Anna Karenina. So I planned on reading these, and I got through a couple months at the beginning of the year, and then my health sort of dipped again with the long COVID. So that I just said, okay, I'm not gonna do this. But yeah, that was one of them. And I know you're a big fan of this next one, the Alexander Dumas, the three Musketeers cycle. That what's his name, Lawrence, whatever. I can't always get his name wrong, but there's the new translations. I want to start reading those.
I might try and get hold of those. Although my Dumas shelf is going to pull the brackets out of the wall soon if I'm not careful. But yeah, those heavy books, particularly in translation, when the translations aren't always great, they take so much brain. They take so much commitment and time.
Yeah.
And they're so rewarding. But because we were going to do that thing about books in translation at one point, many, many years ago. And it really requires more from you than just reading a story, just intellectually. And having the time and space to do that would be such a joy.
Yeah, I'm I got and the thing is, like, he hasn't done it all yet. He hasn't done the whole cycle. So, and then when I didn't get around to do it, because I was just going to read his Three Musketeers, the first one, and then sort of slowly read it. But I'm thinking now I might wait till he's all finished, and then take a couple months and just said, this is all I'm going to read, and just start at page 1, and then. And even like this guy has even written 3 other volumes. Are sort of you can read one chapter of Three Musketeers and read a chapter from his book, and then go back and forth. It tells a consecutive story. Apparently, I don't know how it'll work, but I like the idea of that.
Completely, sort of wow, difficult to read, but. I mean, I find with Musketeers, the first book is very, very readable, and they gradually just become less so. I enjoy them. I love them all, but
then it picks up. I think the Man in Iron Mask is like, it starts on a high point, and then it sort of lulls, and then there's a few high-ish point, and then I think the Man in Iron Mask is pretty high too. From memory. But again, I want to reread it because it's so long since I have.
Yeah. And it's the time. It's the time of it.
Well, once it's done, we will put everything else aside, and we'll just sit and read the cycle in the new translation.
That would be good.
Deal?
That would be really good. I'm not going to say deal because I'm not finishing this roughly yet. But I might try and get hold of those translations if I've got some spare cash knocking about.
They're worth it. They're worth it, I think. They look really good. So anyway, again, we digressed again, but speaking of Victor Hugo, can't sort of leave out Alexander.
So who's next?
Uh,
I'm going to keep it fairly light with the next one, I think. I am going to do, and I cheated here, sorry. The Ingray trilogy by Diana Wynne Jones. I don't have them in the collected trilogy edition. I have them as 3 separate books, one of which is in one of my kids' rooms, which is a pity because I wanted to read a little bit from it. But this is the first one, Howl's Moving Castle. Yeah.
The other way, yeah.
Can't really see it.
Big background.
But there are 3 of them. Howl's Moving Castle, Castle in the Air, and The House of Many Ways. And they are a children's fantasy series set in the world of fairy tales. It is a world where the fact of fairy tales is real. It's a parallel universe to ours. There's always a little bit of sci-fi to Diana Wynne Jones's fantasy. And I'm bringing them here as a representative sample of her work. Because Diana Wynne Jones is statistically my favourite writer. She's possibly not my favourite writer in terms of, if I said this is my favourite book ever, which isn't even on this list, incidentally, or like in the influence she's had, in the influence she's had on my work. But the writer I read most often, who has had the most rereads, who has been a part of my life for the longest, is Diana Wynne Jones. My parents read me Diana Wynne Jones novels when I was a child. They read me Archer's Goon. They read me Dog's Body. As a teen and a preteen, I got Howl's Moving Castle, Fire and Hemlock, all sorts out of the library, Chrestomanci books. I read them all through sort of young adulthood, and I read them to my kids now, and they read them independently as well. There is this continuity in my life that she has always been there. And she is like nobody else. She writes such intelligent worlds. And what I love about her is she will set up the tropes of fantasy or science fiction. So whatever your sort of setup is. And so this one is about the eldest of 3 siblings going out to seek her fortune in a world where fairy tales are real. So the eldest of 3 siblings always gets sort of the shortest shrift. And then just make it about young people sort of manically facing whatever comes at them in a sort of moment-to-moment way. They are funny, they are fast-paced, they are hugely entertaining, and almost by stealth, they make you confront your intergenerational trauma. Her psychological pictures of humanity are dead on. Her look at sort of familial abuse, at abusive friendships, at neglectful parents, at absent parents, at kind of anxious parenting, at the way society mistreats children, at the way children mistreat each other, happens in the most real and affecting way possible, just in the background. And I know, and what I love about her, because she's been part of my life for so long, is that if I bring Ingray with me, I'm also bringing Dalemark with me, I'm bringing Chrestomanci with me, I'm bringing A Tale of Time City and Hexwood with me, because one Diana Wynne Jones book makes me think of every other Diana Wynne Jones book. And they are so healing. Like whenever I'm anxious, whenever I'm stressed, whenever I can't focus, whenever I've just read the first volume of a 19th century novel and I'm feeling a bit sort of fagged out, or I've had a run of exams, it's Diana Wynne Jones. It's Diana Wynne Jones time. But there's nothing worthy about them. They are utterly chaotic. She writes the most desirable men and the most sort of unruly women. Sophie spends most of the first book. If you've seen the Studio Ghibli film, it's based on Howl's Moving Castle. No. She spends famously most of the book under a curse, which makes her appear as sort of a 70 or 80-year-old woman when she's actually kind of internally only sort of 16, 17. And she embraces it in this sort of wild way that it means she can behave as rudely and aggressively as she likes, and sort of finds all this sort of power and confidence in it. And you've got Hal, who is useless and sort of terribly romantic and tortured, and she has absolutely no time for his posing, and they spend the whole book arguing, and it's just... And somehow, in the back of all of this, and sort of two very young people at each other's throats constantly, and magic going wrong, and things get covered in slime, this adventure happens just casually in the background. It's a masterclass in how to do one thing, like to do a magic trick, the magic trick of fiction, to do one thing in the foreground while moving everything behind your characters. And it goes through, so the Howl's Moving Castle is about sort of European fairy tales. Castle in the Air is sort of the Arabian Nights type stories. And the House of Many Ways takes in more of a sort of typical fantasy trope, sort of your lost heir of a kingdom stuff and the lost power of a kingdom. So she moves a little bit outside of the fairy tale model. But that's not what they're about at all. They're just about some kids who've been left unsupervised and are getting up to all manner of shenanigans.
Yeah, because I had not known about that series, but I knew about her as an author, and I just always thought children's author.
Yeah. And
I had to look up this just to get sort of a gist of what these were about. But yeah, I just always thought of her just as a... And it sounds, there's a lot more than that. She's writing for children on the surface, but writing for adults, again, as you say, in the background.
I mean, I think what I would actually say is, no, she's not writing for adults in the background. She's just taking children seriously, which a lot of children's writers just don't do. She never dumbs down to her reader. That's why I loved her as a kid. And it makes it very bearable for adults reading it to their kids, because you don't get sick of it either. But she's not, I don't think, she could, with some of her later works, she could very easily have become an adult fiction writer. They could have marketed them as adult fiction. I've just read Deep Secret, which is not a children's book. It's just not. It's young adult, just at a pinch. But honestly, that's an adult book about a science fiction convention. But she didn't want to. She wanted to write for children, and did it with the utmost art and seriousness and commitment. And it's why she endures. It's why so many adults really love reading her.
Yeah, well, that's somebody I never would have given another second thought, to be honest. But yeah, that's interesting. I'm especially now interested in the one about the science fiction convention.
It is a fantasy novel. It is a fantasy novel that happens at a sci-fi convention, but it's great fun. I would strongly recommend that one.
I'll keep that one in mind as well.
Sorry to keep giving you books to look at.
Yeah. No, you're not, but I'll accept that.
Not remotely, no. But then you keep giving me ones as well, especially new editions of things I've already read.
So we're getting down. What do we have?
2 more
here? Yeah. Now it's a 50-50 chance of which one. Let's you pick. I'm not going to say this one until you do it.
Let's do Jane Austen. Go on then. I want to hear your snarky comments. Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. No, it's saying it's background again. Anyway, it's just a Penguin Classics edition. Austen, I've talked a lot about Bill, my godfather. I've talked a lot about my dad. Austen I get from my mum. I picked this one because I think it's the one that's got the most reading in it. It's not my favourite, but it's got the most to hold and most to trouble, I think. So I grew up fairly solidly surrounded by Austen. My mother is a huge fan. For a while, she was the treasurer of the Kent branch of the Jane Austen Society. We went to sort of Chawton House when we were very little. That we visited a lot of stately homes that had Austen connections. There was the 95 Pride and Prejudice, wonderful, wonderful series. Not just because it's got Colin Firth in a wet shirt, but you know, what can you do? That's not a mark against it. And we had the Kate Winslet and Emma Thompson Sense and Sensibility a lot as well that we watched. But so it's something that I share with my mum. It's something that we understand. And it's very funny. I love a funny book. Like Diana Wynne Jones is partly on this because she's very funny. I find Austen very, very funny. But I love her ways of drawing characters and her ways of taking a world that was incredibly cruel and dangerous and rendering stories in it that I feel sometimes like her characters are ice skaters on ice that is thinner than they think it is, over a pond that is very dark and very deep, and that they aren't aware of it necessarily, although they occasionally become so in sort of this moment of vertigo, which Fanny certainly does in Mansfield Park, but that Austen knows exactly how dark and how deep those waters are. And as a term of sort of social commentary, as a term of emotional resilience, as a way that we walk these tightropes in our lives, she is like no other. And yet there is so much funniness, there is so much love and light and interest in that between those dark spaces. And I know she's not heavily political, but there is a social commentary in her work that remains. There is so much to be said there, particularly in Mansfield Park, where I think she let the pressures of entertaining her reader fall away a little bit. Because I love Pride and Prejudice. Everyone loves Pride and Prejudice. It's, if you like Austen, I read it less as a romance and more as social satire, social commentary, with a romantic vibe. Sense and Sensibility is very similar. Northanger is the funniest. I find Emma very difficult, and Persuasion simply is not finished. I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for saying that, but it needs rewritten, it needs redrafted, because she died before she could finish it. Whereas Mansfield Park, she wrote something else. She wrote something unlike her other work, which is still funny, but it moves more to that sort of slightly distanced social satire of cruelty, and it introduces her characters to a world that sits outside of theirs. She wrote on a very narrow band of gentility. In some sense that there were people above and people below, but this very narrow band of social socially situated people. Whereas Mansfield Park is far more interested in the people above and the people below, and how that life of the middle suspends itself between them as a sort of port of comfort in the face of just the most enormous damage of poverty and degeneracy, I guess. And there's an anxiety in Mansfield Park that is not present in the rest of her work, that makes it fascinating in a way that goes above and beyond what else, the other things she's written, while still being very entertaining, quite funny. So,
well, I do have to at this point say I like Sense and Sensibility in zombies.
Isn't it Sense and Sensibility in sea monsters?
Is there one? There could be one like that as well. I bet. But yeah, no, it's like my sort of story with this is like a lot of the viewers will already know, but you don't know the full thing of this. I read everything of her, or at least the six or seven novels and some of the unfinished ones and some of the juveniles 30 plus years ago. And I didn't like at all. And her and the Brontes sort of, I stopped reading English Victorian sort of style 19th century English literature and went to French. I went to France. And I sort of solidly left those behind. And then I started thinking about other things, and it's your fault that made me start thinking about her again several years ago. But I never did anything about it. But since I'm doing BookTube, there is every year they do a Jane Austen July. So they, there's a bunch of BookTubers that do read something in July. So I thought, just to be controversial, I put out a video called basically detestable authors. And she was obviously on there. And I said that this is my thoughts, were my thoughts of 30 years ago. But nobody or not too many people caught the fact that I was saying this is what I thought then, but I want to reevaluate some of these now. So I'm in the midst, and actually I'm almost done Sense and Sensibility. I'm going to read through her works again chronologically of when they were written. But I am struggling with enjoying, I'm not enjoying Sense and Sensibility. I'll get through it, but I'm finding it very tedious. That's a personal thing for me. But I think I'm looking at it as well. It's her first effort, our adult book that was published. So there are issues, I think, with it. But yeah, no, I am reevaluating it. And you started me on that, but several years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago. But it sort of, I thought I had made, I thought I pushed that aside, but I never did.
I am an unlikely Janeite, and I think that's what converts people. People always assume I'd hate her.
Sorry.
I think it's the social comment. Like, you come for the romance. You read Pride and Prejudice for the romance, for Mr. Darcy in a wet shirt, which doesn't even happen in the novel. I mean, come on. That's not fair. But you come for that. But what keeps you there is the social aspect of her work.
I'm for that. I don't get it. I'm not getting it in Sense and Sensibility, though. But I'm hoping.
No, I think very reasonable. It's. I'm not going to say it's lesser, because that's going to get a load of people jumping on my head. I think her craft improved immeasurably between Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. It's there. You've got to look pretty hard for it. But it's not there. It's not. It's the one I come back to least often of her work, I would say.
It's like the issue that I have with it is that every page, almost every line, has one or two thoughts in it pretty well. It's sort of socially maneuvering to get a husband, a wife, or talking about that kind of thing, and money. Like, it's page after page with rarely anything else. These people don't even go for a piddle. They don't go for the toilet. And they're at dances, and they're still maneuvering for this kind of thing. And I suppose it's because I don't really, like you say, people go for the romance. I don't particularly like romance myself. That's a personal thing. So when there is romance, I like other things happening and then maybe come back to it. This is so concentrated. It's like, think of something a subject you don't like at all. And like, say, for instance, cars. And this is the one that I use it. You got a bunch of teenage boys are, trying to make a soup up their cars and make drag racing and all that. And it's maneuvering to get the best part, talking to each other constantly. And if you dislike cars, you're not going to like that.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing else that's happening.
And I think it might be helpful when you're reading it, to think when they're talking about marriage and money, they're not talking about romance. They're talking about survival.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I do realize that. Yeah. And yeah, it's not the romance part, but it's still too much. It's too much for me.
I think it is the least sophisticated of her work. I would agree with you there.
but there are fascinating little bits, and I just sort of wish, like there's little lines, but she doesn't continue, and I wish she would. It was the wife of the brother, and I'm forgetting names here. This is what the COVID does, but I'm blanking on her name. But when the others move out, the three sisters and the mother move out to the cottage, she's sort of lamenting, how can they have such nice furniture, and be so poor and stuff like this. And I thought that is a very revealing thing about this person.
Yeah.
But it doesn't go any deep. And so far, like, I still got 80 pages, but nothing else so far has come back to that. And there's about 5 or 6 other little tidbits like that I go, I want more, and I don't get it.
And I would say in her defense that she was a sort of social comedian at a time when everyone had known. The thing I find most difficult about Austen, and I keep having to Google when I'm reading her, is how much money was actually worth in modern terms. And the extent to which, when people make comments about money, we go, is that a lot of money? Is that not a lot of money? Who knows? And like the size of a house or the amount of stuff. And then you kind of compare it to the social norms of the time. It's like when Mr. Bennet talks about not really being able to save money. But the amount he earns, and this is just in earnings, not in capital, it illuminates how utterly reckless he is being with his money and has continued to be with his money. And that he has a very, very good income that should have been able to provide significant inheritance for his daughters, as well as the sort of longed for sons, because he's had 21 years to do it. You can miss that if you're kind of going, I'm not quite sure how much money he's actually got and what that really relates to in modern terms. And Sense and Sensibility really hinges on that. And I think in her later books, she was better at grounding it for people who might not be so intimately familiar with it. Whereas Sense and Sensibility at times falls short. And it's why, if you compare the film is quite good at showing up what it actually means in physical terms.
Yeah. Oh, I like. Yeah, that makes all sense, and I like the. I've always liked the adaptations of I'd always be up for watching those rather than reading them. But yeah, that's the one thing, and the other thing that I notice in there too is, like, even in Sense and Sensibility, like, for that social class, that's not that much money, but you look at what the vast majority of people are living on, you're going to have 5 or 6 people to be able to live comfortably on that, like the mass populace. Maybe not 5 or 6, but there's going to be more than just 1 or 2 people surviving on that well. But to them, it's dire straits almost. And I guess that's the other thing, that I don't know if she means that kind of thing. I don't even know if she understands. Like, at least in this book, you have no idea whether she has any understanding of other people that live on much, much less than that in this book.
I think part of that is about work. I mean, obviously, the people in her books, even the quote unquote poor ones, are incredibly privileged. But there was no work, particularly as sort of unattached women. There was no work that they could do.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that is the difference. There's a huge difference between living on £25 a year and having literally no survival skills whatsoever, and earning £25 a year. It's a very specific set of social precariousness in her work.
Yeah, and I just don't think she's pulling all that off. She's not pulling it all together in Sense and Sensibility. And that I'm hoping when I reread the other ones that I start seeing her pulling this stuff together.
Yeah.
Otherwise I get taken away.
I was gonna say, is that you or me? Because that sounded almost here.
Yeah, no,
I think
I'm on the main street and it's just constant. Like, it's about 6 or 7 times during the day, so it's bad. But yeah, no, it like, I am looking forward. It's just I'm struggling with this one, and I'm hoping I don't struggle with the others. But I am struggling. Like, I'm not struggling because it's just That's the thing, because usually when you say you're struggling with something, you don't understand it. I'm understanding it. I just don't like what I'm reading. But
Yeah.
I'm determined to finish it, and I will finish it and then move on. But yeah, that's my most of the viewers. I bet they've tuned out here because they've heard all this from me already. But this was all for your benefit because
No.
it's your fault that I'm here now. That's the thing. It's your fault.
I'll take the blame gladly. Especially when you get to this one. You'll like this one. You won't. But you might like it.
Now, we're at the last one, I think now.
Yeah, we're at the last one. So this is, let's see if my camera will let me pick it up. Yes, moving this way. It's A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers, which is the second book in the Wayfarer series. What to say about this one? So Becky Chambers writes in a far future universe based upon our kind of current planet, where the Earth has essentially died and humanity is split into two groups. There are the Martians, who were the wealthy people on Earth who moved to colonies on terraformed Mars, and then the vast majority of humanity who left a dying planet on Exodus ships. So they are the Exodus fleet, who then arrive in a populated galaxy where they are very much refugees, really. And it's set sort of 50 years before they're sort of recognised as members of the Galactic Council rather than simply outsiders. And it's a really nice inversion of sort of science fiction tropes. The first book is about a mining ship. It's very good, was very, very popular. In about 2015, I think, my old book club read it. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it plenty well. I enjoyed it well enough that when A Closed and Common Orbit came out, I bought it. Because I thought, like the first one, I'll probably like the second one too. 2016 was quite a rough year for me. There was a lot of stuff going on in the world that was quite panic-inducing for a lot of people. There was, at the very beginning of the year, David Bowie died, which might not sound like much, but it meant a lot to me. And the year before, I'd actually lost quite a lot of people in my sort of personal life, friends and things, which I hadn't processed because I had two very young children. I was very, very busy. I was just starting to have problems with chronic fatigue. I'd just come out as transgender. There was like a lot of stuff piled on. I couldn't process really any of it. And then Bowie died, and it all sort of came to a head in terms of grief for me. And it became almost symbolic of all the kind of chaos and confusion in my brain and in my life. Anyway, I'm in Norwich, buy a copy of this, and I get the bus home. And I start reading it on the bus. And by the time the bus pulled into my town, I was about halfway through and in tears. I have never read a book that affected me so profoundly, or that came to me in a time of my life when I needed it so much. It is genuinely a lifeline to me, still, and remains so. And it is a book about making one's life when the purposes through which one has conceived oneself, through which one has persisted in oneself, come to an end, and you lose everything that makes you feel as though you belong here, when even your body is a stranger to you. And it was the first book that, and I don't know how she did it, because as far as I know, she is not transgender, that really explained gender dysphoria to me in a way that let me express it. And the main characters in this are Jane, or Pepper, as she's later known, who is a genetically engineered human on a planet, on a sort of fringe planet of people who are not part of either of the two main human cultures, who kind of use eugenics to breed sort of ideal humans, and their society runs on the existence of sort of genetically limited slave children who repair and build machinery for them. And she escapes one of the factories and lives in a sort of a life of isolation on half of the planet that's covered with refuse heaps, and survives fixing up an old junked shuttle kept company only by the shuttle's AI to escape. And that is one half of the story. And the other half of the story is about an artificial intelligence known as Sidra, who, for various reasons that occur at the end of Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, has been housed in a unit that looks human and doesn't have a ship to monitor. And she is... well, there are two factors. The first is that an AI in a kind of human-looking housing is illegal throughout the Galactic Commons, and if she is discovered to be an AI in a human housing, she will be destroyed, and her programming will be deleted because she is not seen as a full human. But she hates it. She hates being in a body. And it is about how these two sort of differently, deeply damaged people come to some sort of closed circle with themselves. And it's got a thriller bit, and it's got a heist bit, and it's got a lot of alien tech, and it's got a lot of sort of that interest. But really, it's about how we find our humanity in times when our humanity is denied, and how we find our selfhood when our relationship with the world is entirely outside of our control. It's just a very powerful book.
Yeah, well, it's again, every book that you've got really has really made impressions, which is amazing. And this one, and I again, like, I want to thank you on like recording for reminding me of the first book, which I didn't even know there was a second one. It just, as I was saying, you said you did it about 2015. That's where I was sort of, I always say that the science fiction I like is before my birth, so it's like BS, before Sean, so it's 65 and before, and but I do try some newer stuff, and during that time, for about 2014 to 16 or 17, I tried new stuff, but I never got around to this one, her, and I'd completely forgotten, like I'd forgotten the name, the title, everything, until I looked this one up, and I go, that somehow her name sounded familiar, and then I realized that this was the sort of sequel to it, and then I've realized there's two others after that, but yeah. So I'm really thankful for that, because I think I'm going to read that sooner than later, probably next year. I'm starting with a book club, like sort of an online thing that we're doing. There's a bunch of us, and we're sort of each throwing in a book in. Well, I better not say this. Oh, I just destroyed. I just spoiled the thing of my thing, because this is before we do that. Oh well, never mind. Everybody forget what we just said.
Yeah. And I mean, the first one is a great book club book, and it's much more, I mean, you like sort of pre-60s science fiction. It has that sort of original series Star Trek-y vibe to it. It's got, it's got slightly janky tech and sort of real interest in alien culture and alien biology, and how one can move peacefully through the universe. Sorry. A lot of people who like the first one don't like the second one. Or you get people who think the second and third are the best ones in the series, and that's the camp to which I belong.
Well, as I say, I'll start out with the first one and see what I think of it, and then move on. But yeah, I guess we should get moving on here with your music now. And this was, well, the artist was no surprise to me, and it would have been surprised if it wasn't this artist.
Yeah.
I would have been going, "Are you feeling well today?"
So this isn't my favorite album of all time. It's not even my favorite Bowie album of all time. So I have chosen "Let's Dance" by David Bowie, and it's just the best pick-me-up music I know. Every single track on that album is a banger. It's appropriately named. You can't. I'm one of those people who can't sit still to music. I'm always sort of at least swaying a bit or nodding my head. And this one, it gets me up on my feet most of the time. It's really, really powerful, good time music with all of Bowie's experimentalism and strangeness. It's got cat people on it, and it's got Ricochet, and like he does the Bowie stuff. He does the difficult stuff. But it's very, very listenable. And I think it hits a really nice sweet spot. For me, Bowie has always been there. I'm a child of the 80s. So I grew up with music being my dad's vinyl collection, mostly. He had a very good vinyl collection. And in there was The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust, which was my first Bowie. And I loved it. I loved it so much. In a way that possibly explains a lot about my later life. Songs like Lady Stardust and things like that. But I used to masturbate a lot. And I kind of, dabbed in and out, and there were bits I liked and bits I didn't because I was a child. And then I saw the film Labyrinth when I was around the time, a couple of years before I read The Bloody Chamber. And that had an effect, not least the eye-watering tightness of Bowie's pants in it. But the music, the visuals, and again, it was a coming-of-age story, and I was coming of age. And I kind of drifted slowly back into it. And it's just... He was one of the greats musically, I think. I think his legacy, although it has been enormously appreciated, has yet to have that appraisal. He sort of slips behind sometimes some of the other big names, but I think the enormous outpouring of grief at his death suggests the extent to which he was more personally regarded. Even if his music perhaps didn't... Oh, how to express this? Because I'm not properly a historian of music. But, people talk about like the Beatles and the Stones and Led Zeppelin sort of changing the landscape. Whereas Bowie is seen sort of drifting around the edges of it, but he was a true artist doing whatever he felt like at any given moment. It was very unpredictable. His work spans nearly every genre of music. And so he really sort of spoke to people, I think, in a very emotional way. And then in his presentation of selfhood, in his assumption of various roles, and sort of Ziggy Stardust, Aladdin Sane, Halloween Jack, Thin White Duke, all of that, he presented modes of being that were performance, that to people who have social anxiety, to people who are a bit weird, and to people who have weird stuff around their genders and their sexualities, was, and I say weird stuff, kind of quite just anything that isn't sort of, straight, cis, heterosexual, but also just people who are a bit odd. And as somebody who is not straight or cis or, normal, in regards, I am just also a weirdo on top of all of that. There was something very reassuring and liberating about Bowie. And although Let's Dance is perhaps one of his more sort of normative phases, it still carries that wonderful energy, Criminal World is a wonderful example of that. It's a very queer song, and I love that for it. So if my energy is ever low, this is one of the sort of 3 albums I would pick to sort of boost me right back up again. And to just listen to it all day. I listened to it early just to make sure it was definitely the right choice. And when I was working, I just let it run through 3 times without noticing. So that's how good it is for me.
Yeah, well, I was a bit surprised at the album, but now it makes more sense. But
Mm.
yeah, that's the thing. Like I think the music, it's like the one what I chose was very different, but
Mm.
it was something that when I listen to it, it makes me think of other things too, and that's
Mm.
where it also makes you think of the artist's catalog. But I think also other things in life. It reminds you of other things, and that's where you can listen to something like that over and over. And I understand
Mm.
that. And my pick was "A Farewell to Kings" by Rush.
Mm.
But like most
Yeah.
people, and the reason why is because there's things in there that's about history, like reminds me of history, science fiction, as well as film. It's just the whole
Mm.
gambit makes me think of these other things. So like you
Yes.
said before, that you bring the one book or something like that, and you bring everything
Mm.
because it reminds you of these other things, and that's where that for the album, that's what did it for me. And I think for you, it not only just brings his other stuff by sounds of it, it brings like a lot of things of your life, your steps in your life as well. And
Yeah.
so yeah, that works.
Yeah.
As if I need to say and say that, but I know that probably in hindsight sounded pretentious, but I didn't mean it that way.
No, it's hard to pick just one album. I mean, it's got to be one with a lot of listening to it. Like my favorite Bowie album is probably Low, but I couldn't listen to that back to back. I couldn't. Like that's one I sort of sit and listen to. I let the mood carry me, but it's work.
Hmm.
Whereas Let's Dance, it's not work.
Yeah, it's probably his most pop album too. I think I would
Yeah.
say it's his most popish album. You
Yeah.
know, because as you say, like he just went through different phases, and I think everybody has their favorite Bowie phase. If
Yeah.
they do like David Bowie, like to me, for him, it's always going to be Ziggy Stardust for me.
Yeah.
It's always. And the other thing that when I think of him is him singing the little drummer boy with Bing Crosby on a Christmas special that I remember watching
Yeah.
as a kid live. David
Yeah.
Bowie and Bing Crosby, you couldn't see ever the two, but it works. It's
No,
beautiful.
and it does. And his diversity is what makes him so spectacular, I think. And the other thing about Let's Dance is I don't call me on the dates because I'm terrible at them, but it sits quite nicely in the middle, both in terms of genre and in terms of time period. It's not very,
Oh,
very early. It's not his kind of most recent stuff. It's nicely situated that it draws it all sort of through it.
cool. Now, luxury item. That's what I was looking at to remind me of the luxury. Usually, I try not to know what the luxury item is. I forgot to tell you that, so
Oh,
it's
sorry.
a bit of a surprise. But that was my fault. So, what is your
Well, I can
luxury item?
change it if you want.
No, no. That's well, if you want to, if you want to keep it, that's fine. And if there's something else, then you can do that as well.
It's a difficult one because my luxury item is, as written down, as I sent to you, was a deck of tarot cards. I debated, and in fact, I debated having for my 8th book the textbook for my martial art that I'm currently working on. And I all day have been going back and forth between the two, and they represent two very different luxury brain states. And I think I'll sit with the tarot card because for me, so I've been reading cards since I was about 14, 15. Got my first deck then. And it's something I've always meant to give more time to. I mean, I can do it fine, but like more study is always rewarding. But they are a very good way of shaping the brain. One of the things about the book Little Big is that it's actually based around a deck of tarot cards, not the major arcana. Crucially, it's a sort of a different deck, but it's one, unlike most fantasy tarot decks, feels very true. It is a way of structuring your brain to think through symbols, which as a storyteller, as a writer, is something that is very, very important to me. You know, each of the suits represents part of a kind of aspect of your humanity. So you've got your cups, which represent emotion, flow state, change, the unconscious. You've got wands, which are sort of the active desire outwards, the creativity, growth, and air. You've got swords, which are fire, and a hum. They're also sort of focused energy and physical change. And then you've got pentacles, which are sort of earth and material things. And you kind of run through the numbers of the suits. And then you've got your major arcana, which sort of symbolize, if you can get Jungian about it, sort of the great unconscious things and archetypes. And I love them. There's nothing so soothing as using a deck of cards, unless they are shouting at you, which is not soothing at all. But I think on a desert island, there wouldn't be much for them to shout at me about. So, but what you can also do, and this is probably going to get me completely strung up, but I have done it, is you can take the trumps out and you can use them as a regular deck. So you can play Patience or Solitaire or any one of a number of things, because they are just cards. I mean, and I would like, probably not my deck, but a pip deck where the minor arcana are just pip cards, as you would get in a standard deck.
Interesting, yeah. I never really like. I find the aesthetics of them interesting, but from that, I've never looked into it. I find it interesting, but I always like the aesthetics of the look of tarot cards. The pictures on. I know there's different types with different sort of what's the word, imagery, I guess, yeah, to a certain extent, but that's all I know about them basically. So I'm always interested in it, but I've never taken the plunge to read anything more deeper for some reason.
No, and it's my family are card players. We always have been. So I grew up playing cards a lot. My dad used to do card tricks and cheat in family games of cards. He can trick shuffle, which it's not a great thing to grow up knowing about, and it always sort of works against you. But we had a lot of fun on holidays when it was rainy, sort of playing cards together. And then he taught me divination when I was a teenager, and when I got my first deck, because I was interested in that sort of thing. And yeah, it's always been like all through my adulthood. It's been something I just come back to. It's very, very reassuring.
This has been very enjoyable. And this is the first, I want everybody to know too, this is the first time we've actually spoken together, rather than through messages and texting and that type of thing as well. So it's been, for me, it's been very, very enjoyable. So thank you, Fred, for doing this. And with your writing, is there anywhere that people can go if they're interested? Well, I'm hoping people are interested, other than your Twitter account. Are there other sites that you have that I can put down the links?
So I have a very neglected website, which is www.alice-earl.com. I think I've got that right.
I'll put the link down at the bottom, definitely.
Yeah, but it's ALYS. It's neglected, but it is there. And I have a Facebook page as well under the same name. I keep meaning to change that to AWL, but we'll get around to it eventually. And then there is Twitter, while it still stands. That is probably the best place to find me for now.
Yeah, I'll definitely put everything down. You send me all the links again just to make sure.
I'm gonna do that.
And it's something I want to plug of my own, because we talked about M.R. James, is the interview that I did with Dr. Jane mainly Pittock. That she's coming out with a collection of his letters, which will be published in February. So I did an interview, and I'll put that down below as well, just because we talked about it. It is a self plug for me, but it's worth anybody watching that is interested in M.R. James for sure. And
she's a serious authority on it in a way that I'm very much not.
Yeah, well, she did her PhD dissertation, and this is the great thing. I got to know her the same way and roughly the same time as you. And I'm
Mm.
not sure which one came first,
No.
but it doesn't matter. But it's like I'm going to be having. I'm going to force her to be a castaway as well.
Excellent.
And you got to remember this, and I didn't say this to you, that this island is a multi-dimensional island. There's only one island, so everybody's on there, but it's multi-dimensional.
So we've got no contact with each other.
No. Anyway, so again, thanks very much, and yeah, we should do something else another time on something. I think, and if people do want that, and I'm sure, and even if they don't, I don't care. Well, it's just because they get tired of seeing me, so I figure it's always nice to have somebody else.
Well, if you want to chat about Anne Rice, I am doing a big reread for this podcast, Bites podcast. So, if you want to share thoughts about that at any point, let me know.
Yeah, well, I haven't read it, so that could be interesting. Then I could quiz you on it, and you could tell me and tell me about Anne Rice and her books.
I wouldn't go that far.
If anybody wants to see that, say so in the comments, and because I haven't read, so this will be coming from. I'll get the plots in my mind, and then we can go from there and riff on that. And I'll probably go, what? To me. Anyway, thank you for doing this, and thank you everybody and I do apologize, the glitch and everything. I'm gonna have to put a little notice somewhere to say that there is a glitch in the beginning, but that's always potentially going to happen, and I just don't have the editing skills to edit that out, so it's there for all time.
And thanks very much for having me. It's been lovely.
Stick around. We'll just have a chat after. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.